Hello everyone. We're moving on to lesson 6 of this Python course. So we learned many things already, uh, ranging from how the computer actually works all the way to Boolean, if statements, and loops. And now we're kind of going to start moving forward. We're going to be learning major components of a program. Now, we can all write a program in Python just using the basic knowledge that we know. Like for loops, uh, the if statements, the while loops. We can accomplish certain tasks given the knowledge that we know. But the thing is, if we want to be able to more efficiently be able to uh, manipulate this language, then we can move on to something known as functions.
Okay, okay. So a function is a block of reusable code that takes an input and gives a specific output. So, for example, um, f of x equals x plus 3. So x is the input, and then f of x is the output. An input of 1 always gives 4 because 1 plus 3 is 4. So the input is consistent, and the output is consistent.
So the reason why we want to learn about functions is because functions is very important for something uh, known as code reuse. Now, the reason why we want to learn how code reuse will work is because, well, it allows us to perform multiple actions uh, multiple times. And so, if we want to be able to perform the same action, typically the first thing that we would go to would be copy and paste. However, this is not the most efficient way in doing this, as it can take up a lot of space.
So instead of needing to copy and paste, all you can do is um, write the code for the function and then call the function. So calling the function only takes like one line, and This will make it much easier to just read the code and you can see what you're doing. Um, in addition to being easier to see where your code is, you can also edit the code in a function and in a function that's used multiple times. Instead of needing to edit every line of code, you can just edit the function's code.
This can save you a lot of time because instead of having to change everything, it's just one simple change. So in terms of debugging, this will make your life a lot easier. So instead of having to write the same code over and over again, you can just call the same function. Now, as for how will we actually use this function? Well, so we haven't introduced you to this yet, but there's something known as CodingBat. And CodingBat is a software that uses functions in order for you to complete the assignments that they give. And up until this point, we haven't learned about functions, so it would be hard to understand how defining the function works and how the website will call the function and grade you on it. But now that we're going into functions, we can kind of explain how functions work and also how we can properly kind of complete these assignments. So um, there's a few basic parts to a function that we will that are very important to look at. The first part of the function is putting in the define keyword, or DEF. So this tells Python you're making a function. So next is the name of the function. So this can be anything as long as it's not a already predefined function in Python. So for example, you can't use like define um, define, right? You can't do that because that means that you're overriding uh, an inherent method inside of the Python language, and so it will give you an error. But over here in this example, it uses define my function. So this allows it to tell to know the name that you're going to be using when you call a function. Now there's a parentheses right here, so you can see that there's nothing inside these parentheses, but this is because there are no parameters. Now, parameters are essentially values that you use as input into this function. So, say you wanted to create an add function, and you want to add, say, 2 and 3. Now, in order for you to add these two numbers together, you can't just call the add function. What you need to do is you need to tell a function, I want you to add the two parameters 2 and 3. And so the way you will tell the function that is when you call a function, you will give it two values inside the parentheses. So over here, as you can see, where it calls it, inside these parentheses is where you would put 2 and 3. Now over here in the parameter portion of defining the function, what you would do is you would put two variables. And so these two variables are what are going to be used inside of this function. Now, if you were to say define variable a outside of this function, and you try to call it inside of the function, and it is in the same file, then that means that you can still use that variable because it is in the same file. However, if you define variable a inside of my function here, you cannot access it anywhere else except for inside my function. This is important because this is a concept known as variable scope. And so scope is important because it allows you to identify where a value is initialized, where the value is where the variable is given a value and where the variable can be changed. Now, if you were to define variable a inside this function, and after the function you define another variable a, those are two completely separate variables, even though they both share the same name. Now this can get very confusing because sometimes variable names can be very similar to each other. So when you write your program, it is always smart to name your variables after something that is in relation to the value that it will hold. So another name for the parameters is called arguments. So these arguments, essentially what they will do is it's the exact same thing as parameters. Now, it's also important in Python to understand that Python will automatically detect the type of this variable over here. So when you call this function over here, you print it as fname plus refsness. And when you call the function here, you give it a string. Now, when you input this string, Python will automatically tell this is a string because you have these two double quotation marks around it. In other languages, this does not happen, and you actually need to identify the type of variable that is going to go in, as well as the output of the function. So if you want to return, say, a sum, then you would be returning an integer, and this needs to be written into the program in order for it to be kind of like a legitimate program. Otherwise, it will give you an error. And the reason why Python is so great for beginners is because sometimes this code can get quite confusing, and Python will identify the data types for you. So it brings up the two definitions of parameter or arguments. They are the exact same thing, just different names for it. And now we get into the number of arguments. So when you give it two arguments, say you're trying to print a list of names, and you give it 5 spaces for arguments, but you only enter in 3, you cannot do this because it requires the same number of arguments to be entered when you call a function as when you define the function. So for every single one of these values that you have inside of the arguments over here, and when it prints it out inside of the method, it needs to make sure that each one of the variables has a value, or else it will give you an error when you call the function. Here's an example when you don't input the same number in the arguments as when you call the function. I'll give you guys a moment to look at this example and make sure you guys understand it, because this is very important moving forward. So now that you guys have had a little time to look at this and examine this example a little more, um, we're going to move on. So there's this arbitrary arguments. It's you don't really need to learn this. It is a tad bit complicated. There's also keyword arguments. These are essentially just all different types of arguments that you can enter in to the function, and we can go into a little more detail in this later. However, usually the only type of argument that you would normally use is just the regular arguments like we see over here. Um, you won't see like um, the star args or 2 stars or anything like that. So when you return the value, you need to make sure that say you're returning like 5 times x over here, right? You need to make sure that you have the data type sorted out. So say you are trying to write a function that will add 2 numbers together, and then that function will then print out that solution, and then using that solution it will multiply that by 5. Throughout this entire process, you need to make sure that the parameters you enter in are integers and the parameters that you return are also integers. Because if you do not do this, then that means that you're essentially either trying to multiply a string by 5, which will just return the string 5 times, or you're going to end up with some other solution that you did not expect. Just like in loops, there is a pass statement. And so the pass statement is used to avoid an error. So say you're trying to do something, and you know that one of the variables will end up not having a value in some of the cases. Now, typically, when you try and return a variable that does not have a value, it will give you an error. However, if you put pass, then that means that it will essentially ignore the error, and it will acknowledge the fact that you know that there is an error at that point, but it will continue moving on, and it will return a variable with no value. And here we get into something known as recursion. Recursion is one of the most complicated topics in programming. As a concept, it is very simple. However, it can be very tricky to deal with. Recursion can there are many different things that can happen in a recursive program, or a recursive method. So typically you will have a method that will call this recursive method and kind of kick it off. This method is not recursive, and it simply calls another method that is recursive. Now inside the recursive method, when you call this method itself inside of it, what you will need is you'll need something known as a base case. Now a base case is essentially a case where you don't call yourself, because if you were to infinitely call yourself, then you would get an overflow error because it would never stop. Now this base case, it can be implemented in many ways. Typically, the base case is implemented when a certain criteria is met. Either it hits a certain value or it completes a certain task, and so the recursive method will stop. And so recursion can have many different layers to it, as it is a very complicated topic, and it's not something that is easy to cover. So I will just get into kind of the basics of it. So basically, the reason why you want to use recursion is because it allows you to use the output of the method as the inputs of the method again. Now, this can be you're trying to say find the best way through a maze, and you want to make sure you try each path possible. Now, if there's like a split in the maze, instead of having to go through one at a time, one end at a time, and then go through the other end, essentially you can just go through both ends, and when one end ends in say a dead end, then that that tracking or that like branch off will kind of just end itself, and it will no longer keep on going. So this is a great way when you have a lot of cases to cover, and you know that maybe looping through it wouldn't be the best idea. So that's kind of a very brief overview on recursion. Now there's much more to it, so uh, if you want, you can do more research. Now, I'm going to go to another website on functions, and this is just going to kind of uh, give a more stable understanding on functions. But I'll let you guys look at this recursive method a little more because it can be hard to grasp at first. now that we've looked at recursion a little bit, I'm just gonna kind of quickly go through this website. It's essentially um, the same thing as this weschools.com. Now, these two sources are very good if you're trying to learn Python on your own and say you didn't understand a concept in this class very well. So, I'm gonna go through this very quickly because I have one more thing after this and our time is about to expire. So, defining a function, you need to make sure you need to use the keyword def, followed by the function name and the parentheses. You need to make sure you include all the inputs you want. And so, the first statement, uh, it can be anything, because it can be like a pass string into it, which is essentially a string that it gives the value to the string. On there has to be the colon afterwards in order for you to kind of finish off the function definition statement. And returning it means that you actually give the value or assign the value. When you call the function, you need to make sure that you match the number of parameters that you require. You call the actual correct function name, and if you want to say capture the value, then you want to store it in a variable. So say instead of just calling print me here, you can say call uh, a is equal to print me, and followed by the parameter, and so it will return whatever you want to return over here. So this is just kind of going into the specifics of what you can put into the parameters. So you can put like a list into parameters. Over here you can see that you can put like a variable that's assigned to a list in the parameters. And so in the function arguments, this is very important. You need to make sure you have the required arguments. There are the keyword arguments, default, and variable length. So these four, you don't really need to know like what each one of them does. Just make sure that when you define your function, make sure that you have the correct type of arguments. So the rest of this is just kind of going into the specific arguments, and so we will need to look at that because all you will really need to know is just the keyword arguments. Now, as for the last thing that we're going to be talking about in this class is coding events. So I mentioned it in the middle of this class. Here it is. No, that ain't it.
So as Matthew said before, coding that's a Python website and Java. So it has multiple warm-ups, exercises that we can use. So basically, Google Forms was made. So there's 6 exercises in that Google's Forms. So if you would complete that by the end of the week, and we'll grade it and see what you have to work on, that'll be great.
Yep, and we posted the Google Forms in the WeChat. If you don't get it, just ask your parents, and we can send it to you guys one more time. So that'll kind of wrap up the class for today. If you have any questions, then I guess just put it in the chat, and we can see if we can answer it. I guess that will wrap up the stream for today then. See you guys when the real class starts, I guess.